The morning sky above the bustling airport was a soft shade of orange, promising a clear day. Flight 728, a mid-sized commercial jet, sat at the gate with its engines humming softly, passengers boarding in orderly lines. The crew moved with practiced precision, flight attendants offering reassuring smiles, pilots exchanging clipped greetings as they ran through pre-flight checks. To the casual observer, it was just another routine flight, one among hundreds leaving that busy terminal that day. Among the passengers was Evan Carter, an 11-year-old boy whose excitement contrasted sharply with the sleepy faces around him. He clutched his small backpack, bouncing slightly on his heels as he peered through the small window beside his seat. Today, he was traveling with his mother, Linda, to visit relatives for the weekend. Most children his age would have been glued to a tablet or playing games on a handheld console, but Evan was different. Airplanes fascinated him. Every detail, the hum of the engines, the sleek metal wings, the orderly chaos of passengers loading, held his attention. Evan's seat, unusually close to the cockpit, had been a last-minute change orchestrated by his mother after a random request to sit near the window. Now, from his vantage point, he could see the cockpit door slightly ajar, catching glimpses of the pilot's careful movements. His mother noticed his intense focus and smiled. "You're like a little detective, aren't you?" she teased. Evan grinned but didn't respond. His eyes never left the cockpit. All around the cabin, life was unfolding in quiet normality. A businesswoman tapped away at her laptop, headphones over her ears. A father tried to calm his fussy toddler, while an elderly couple settled into their seats with relief, grateful for a smooth morning departure. Flight attendants moved methodically up and down the aisles, offering water and answering polite questions. The safety announcements played, and passengers dutifully strapped themselves in. For the people on Flight 728, nothing suggested that this flight would ever be remembered, or that it would descend into chaos before it even reached cruising altitude. Evan, however, noticed small things others didn't. He had spent countless weekends in flight simulators at home, guided by a pilot uncle who had once flown for a regional airline. He knew how a plane should sound, how the hum of the engine should feel, and how the controls moved with precision. The faint vibration beneath the cabin floor, the subtle tilt as the plane taxied toward the runway, all of it was catalogued in his sharp, observant mind. Most passengers thought nothing of it, dismissing it as part of the normal flight experience. Evan, however, catalogued each detail silently. As the final boarding calls echoed through the terminal, Flight 728's engines powered up, a deep rumble vibrating through the cabin. Passengers felt the pull of acceleration as the plane began its taxi. Evan's eyes sparkled with anticipation. He leaned forward, pressing his small hands against the armrest, imagining what it would feel like to sit in the cockpit, to hold the yoke himself. He imagined the planes he had seen at the museum, the complex controls, the sense of weight and responsibility that came with flying. Soon the plane lined up on the runway. The pilots' voices crackled briefly over the intercom, confirming with the tower and preparing for takeoff. The cabin crew took their seats, and the hum of conversation faded as engines roared louder. The wheels sped along the tarmac, picking up momentum, and with a smooth, almost effortless motion, Flight 728 lifted off the ground. Windows blurred as the airport shrank beneath them. The morning sun reflected off the wings, creating fleeting flashes of gold that danced across the cabin walls. For a brief moment, everything felt magical, ordinary, perfect. Children pressed their faces to the windows. Passengers leaned back in their seats, some dozing off, others staring at the clouds. And Evan, heart pounding with excitement, still couldn't tear his eyes from the cockpit. Little did he know, this ordinary morning flight, the kind people would typically forget within hours, was about to become a story that no one would ever forget. A story that would test courage, knowledge, and instincts in ways even he could never have imagined. For the first few minutes after takeoff, the passengers of Flight 728 settled into the rhythm of flight. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and the gentle hum of the engines became a soothing background noise. Children laughed quietly, passengers opened magazines, and the flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking on everyone. Evan pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window, mesmerized by the tiny city below, shrinking into a mosaic of roads and rooftops. But then, without warning, the hum changed. A subtle shudder ran through the cabin floor, so faint that most passengers thought it was just turbulence. Evan noticed it immediately. He leaned closer to his mother and whispered, "That doesn't feel right." Linda patted his shoulder and smiled, thinking it was just a child's overactive imagination. Minutes later, the tremor intensified. A warning alarm sounded from the cockpit, a sharp, urgent tone that made some passengers jump in their seats. The engines, which had been steady, emitted a higher-pitched vibration, almost like a pulse. The plane dipped slightly to the left, throwing a few passengers forward. Drinks spilled, papers fluttered, and the cabin lights flickered. The suddenness of it made everyone tense. Flight attendants gripped the overhead bins for balance, calling out calmly, "Please stay seated." Inside the cockpit, the scene was far more alarming. Pilot Captain Michael Reynolds, a veteran with over 20 years of experience, was struggling with a rapidly failing instrument panel. Alarms blared from multiple systems, one indicating engine trouble, another signaling a hydraulic malfunction. Co-pilot Sarah Mitchell's hands flew across the controls, but her face was pale. She reached for a switch and realized her radio wasn't transmitting properly. The plane lurched violently again, nose dipping. The cabin shook in a way passengers had never felt before. Then it happened. Captain Reynolds slumped forward suddenly, a faint groan escaping his lips. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Mike," she yelled, shaking him. He didn't respond. She realized he had collapsed. The plane was now dangerously unsteady, tilting unpredictably, and the autopilot had disengaged. Panic rippled through the cockpit as Sarah fought to stabilize the aircraft manually. Every second stretched unbearably. Back in the cabin, passengers exchanged terrified glances. Some tried to reassure children, holding them close. Others whispered prayers under their breath. The seatbelt sign blinked relentlessly, and a nervous flight attendant reminded everyone, "Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The murmurs of concern escalated into whispers of panic as the plane shuddered again, violently this time. Drinks and food trays toppled to the floor, clattering loudly. Evan, for his part, remained unusually calm. He had studied emergencies in flight simulators for years, memorizing the way planes behaved under duress. He noticed the angle of the wings, the flicker of lights on the instrument panel, and the subtle vibration in the yoke that he could see through the glass of the cockpit door. Something deep inside him clicked. This was not ordinary turbulence. This was an emergency, and someone had to act before it spiraled completely out of control. Sarah's voice, tense and sharp, cut through the cabin intercom. "Passengers, remain calm. We are experiencing technical difficulties." Her words offered little comfort. The tremors grew stronger, and a sudden lurch caused a young boy to cry out. The plane was losing altitude slightly, a fact that no one except the pilots or the child pressed against the cockpit glass had the presence of mind to notice fully. As the minutes dragged, every second became a test of nerves. Sarah's arms shook from exertion as she fought to keep Flight 728 level. Alarms continued their relentless wail. Outside, the sun gleamed off the wingtip, oblivious to the chaos inside. And through it all, Evan remained silent, observing, calculating, readying himself for the moment he feared he might need to face, a moment no 11-year-old should ever imagine. The plane dipped again, sharper this time, sending a wave of fear through the cabin. Sarah's voice cracked as she reached for the radio, calling for help. "Tower, Flight 728, where we have a problem." Static filled the line. The radio sputtered and went dead. The tower repeated its call. No response. For the first time, silence descended. A silence that was heavier than any alarm, louder than any shout. 222 lives hung in the balance, and no one on board yet realized that the person who might save them was a boy watching everything from the cockpit doorway, already preparing for the unthinkable. The calm of the skis vanished as Flight 728 continued its climb, leaving the airport behind like a distant memory. Inside the cabin, passengers were beginning to feel the invisible tension that seemed to hang over the aircraft. The plane shuddered again, and whispers turned into uneasy murmurs. Children clutched the arms of their parents, and even seasoned travelers felt their stomachs tighten. Every bump and vibration now carried weight. Every flicker of the overhead lights felt like a warning. In the cockpit, co-pilot Sarah Mitchell was fighting an uphill battle against both fear and malfunctioning instruments. She had tried to steady the plane manually, but every movement brought new alarms. The aircraft shuddered violently, and her grip on the yoke became a lifeline, her knuckles whitening. Captain Reynolds was still slumped forward, his head resting limply against the console. Sarah's mind raced. One wrong move, and Flight 728 could spiral out of control at 30,000 feet. "Tower, this is Flight 728, she called, voice tight but steady. "We were experiencing multiple failures requesting immediate assistance." Static crackled through the radio. She tried again. "Tower, Flight 728, do you read? Over." Nothing. Silence. The flight tower at the airport had already noticed something was wrong. The radar showed the plane drifting slightly off its assigned course. Controllers repeatedly called Flight 728 expecting a response, but each transmission met only silence. Panic began to ripple through the control room. Air traffic controllers exchanged tense glances. "That's impossible," one murmured. "They should have responded by now." Back in the cabin, passengers were growing restless. Murmurs had escalated into questions shouted across aisles. Flight attendants tried to calm everyone, but the fear in their own eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. Drinks sloshed and trays rattled with every sharp lurch. People clutched the armrests as the plane tilted slightly to the left, then to the right. The feeling was subtle, yet unmistakably wrong. No turbulence should behave like this. Meanwhile, Evan Carter, seated near the cockpit, was watching everything with a focus that no adult could match. He had spent countless hours in flight simulators, memorizing how aircraft responded to emergencies. Every detail, the tilt of the wings, the humming of the engines, the pattern of the warning lights, was registering in his mind. Evan realized something terrifying. The adults in the cockpit were struggling to keep control, and if no one acted, the situation could spiral into disaster. Then came the lurch. The plane dropped suddenly, sending a wave of panic through the cabin. A man cried out, clutching his armrest. Drinks and snacks spilled to the floor, clattering against the seats. A mother wrapped her arms around her child, whispering words of comfort that she didn't entirely believe herself. Sarah's hands shook on the controls as she struggled to keep the plane level, her heart pounding in her ears. She reached for the radio again. "Tower, please respond." Static was the only reply. Outside, the sky remained deceptively calm, the sun sparkling across the plane's wings as if nothing were wrong. But inside, chaos was mounting. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The tower continued calling, the repetition almost frantic now. And still, Flight 728 remained silent. It was then that Evan noticed something no one else could. Through the small gap in the cockpit door, he could see the plane's heading slipping slightly. The instruments indicated they were losing altitude. Panic threatened to overtake him, but he forced himself to focus. He knew, somehow, that the adults in the cockpit were struggling beyond their capacity. If they couldn't regain control, the consequences would be catastrophic. The next moments were surreal. Flight 728 was now drifting slightly off course, altitude fluctuating. Passengers whispered prayers, braced for what felt inevitable. Flight attendants gritted their teeth, trying to maintain calm in the aisles. And somewhere between fear and instinct, Evan realized he was the only one who might be able to make a difference. As the plane continued its dangerous, unsteady climb, one thought consumed him. "I have to do something. I have to help." The silence between Flight 728 and the tower was no longer just a lack of communication. It was a void filled with fear, suspense, and the possibility of disaster. and into that void an 11-year-old boy would soon step, changing the course of the flight, and the fate of 222 lives forever. The turbulence continued, shaking Flight 728 like a fragile toy in the hands of fate. Inside the cabin, fear had solidified into panic. Children whimpered, some buried their faces into the laps of their parents. A man muttered under his breath, "We're going down," while an elderly woman gripped the seat in front of her as if holding onto life itself. Flight attendants moved as fast as they could, trying to calm passengers, but even their calm was strained, brittle, and barely believable. In the midst of it all, 11-year-old Evan Carter remained unnervingly focused. Where adults saw chaos, he saw patterns. Years of simulating emergencies in flight software had trained him to notice small anomalies, a dial slightly off, a gauge flickering, a subtle tilt of the wings. His mind raced with every detail of the aircraft's behavior. The plane was not just unsteady, it was unstable. And the adults in the cockpit, his mother included, didn't fully realize the severity. Evan's mother, Linda, noticed his unusual stillness and leaned closer. "Evan, sweetie, maybe you should stay in your seat." Her voice was tight, betraying her fear, but Evan barely looked at her. His eyes were glued to the cockpit door, where the remaining pilot, Sarah Mitchell, struggled to maintain control. Sarah's hands shook visibly on the yoke, her knuckles white. Every alarm in the cockpit blared, demanding immediate attention. Evan could see the subtle signs others couldn't. The plane was slowly veering off its intended course. The cabin dips and jolts were not ordinary turbulence, they were warnings. He noticed a warning light blinking rapidly on the instrument panel, one he recognized from simulator training as a critical system alert. He realized that if the plane wasn't stabilized immediately, it would continue to drift, and the consequences could be catastrophic. His heart pounded, but his mind remained clear. He understood the impossible weight of the moment. An 11-year-old shouldn't be thinking like this. Children shouldn't be capable of handling life-and-death situations at 30,000 feet. But years of preparation, hobbyist flight simulators, museum visits, and stories from his pilot uncle had unknowingly trained him for this exact scenario. He had an instinctive understanding of the yoke, the pedals, and how small corrections could stabilize a plane. Suddenly, a flight attendant appeared at his row, glancing at him with a mix of desperation and hope. "Do you have any experience flying?" she asked, voice trembling. Evan hesitated. He was just a kid. But deep down, he knew he had the knowledge, if not the formal training. He nodded, barely audible. "Yes, I think I can help." Linda's eyes widened in shock. "Evan, what? No, it's too dangerous." But there was no time for arguments. The pilot slumped further in the cockpit, nearly unconscious. Sarah Mitchell's eyes darted to the yoke, panic flashing across her face. Evan realized the unthinkable. If he didn't act, no one else might be able to save the plane. Evan took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He focused on what he had learned in simulators: small, precise movements, constant adjustments, and maintaining calm under pressure. He remembered his uncle's words: "The plane listens to your hands. Stay calm, think ahead, and let it respond to you." As he stood, guided by a flight attendant and his mother, Evan's small hands gripped the cockpit doorframe. He felt the heat of the plane's engines, the vibrations beneath his feet, and the roar of alarms surrounding him. This was no longer a game. This was real. Every decision, every movement could be the difference between life and death. Sarah Mitchell, barely able to speak, glanced at the boy standing at the threshold of the cockpit. If you can help, take the yoke," she said, her voice trembling. Evan nodded, swallowing his fear. He climbed up into the pilot's seat, heart hammering, hands hovering over the controls. The plane continued to wobble violently, and the cabin shook with every jolt. And in that moment, the entire aircraft, 222 passengers, panicked and terrified, was about to place its fate in the hands of an 11-year-old boy who had noticed what no one else had. The patterns of danger, the silent cues of disaster, and the courage to act when everyone else was paralyzed by fear. Evan exhaled slowly, his small fingers tightening on the yoke. Outside the cockpit, the sun reflected off the wings, innocent and oblivious. Inside, everything depended on his next move. The cockpit was a storm of alarms, blinking lights, and the low rumble of engines that seemed almost alive. Captain Reynolds remained slumped forward, unconscious and unresponsive. Co-pilot Sarah Mitchell, exhausted and shaken, barely managed to hold onto the yoke, her eyes wide with fear. Outside the cockpit window, the sun reflected off the wingtip, calm and serene, a cruel contrast to the chaos inside. Evan Carter, the 11-year-old boy who had been watching everything unfold from his seat nearby, now stood in the cockpit, hands trembling as they hovered above the controls. For a moment, reality pressed down on him like a weight too heavy to lift. He was just a child. He had never flown a real plane, yet every instinct he had learned in countless hours of flight simulators came rushing forward. Every detail of altitude, speed, and tilt he had memorized now mattered more than anything else in his young life. Sarah glanced at him, desperation etched into her features. If you can help, take it. Please, she whispered, her voice breaking. Evan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. The plane dipped suddenly, sending a shiver of fear through the cabin. Passengers screamed or clutched their seats as the aircraft wobbled. Evan climbed into the pilot's seat. His small legs barely reached the pedals, and his hands were too short to fully grip the yoke, but he adjusted carefully. He took a deep breath, remembering every lesson from the simulators. Small adjustments, smooth movements. Let the plane respond to you. The first moments were terrifying. The aircraft pitched slightly to the left, sending a wave of nausea through Evan. His fingers shook and he felt sweat prickling his forehead. Sarah guided him verbally, her calm, precise instructions cutting through the cacophony of alarms. Push gently, adjust slowly, keep it level. You can do this. Evan's hands moved with growing confidence. He corrected the tilt of the plane, then the slight dip in altitude. The wings leveled out, and the passengers felt a subtle but noticeable change. The shaking eased just slightly, enough to give a glimmer of hope. Murmurs replaced screams in the cabin. People began to sense that control had returned, even if they didn't know who was at the helm. The radio crackled suddenly. "Flight 728, do you read?" Sarah gestured for Evan to respond. His small voice barely carried over the intercom. "Tower I, I'm controlling the plane. We need guidance for an emergency landing," he said, each word steady despite the fear racing through him. Silence followed on the other end, then a calm, incredulous voice replied, "Repeat. Did you say a child is flying?" Evan's heart pounded, but he kept his focus. "Yes," he said quietly, "please help me land safely." The tower's response was immediate, measured, and clear. "Flight 728, we're here. Listen carefully. We'll guide you. You're doing great. Keep steady." For the next several minutes, Evan made tiny, precise adjustments. Each movement required immense concentration. The plane dipped, he corrected. It rolled slightly, he leveled it. Every second was a battle against instinct and fear, a contest between life and death. Sarah coached him, the words steady and precise. "Altimeter, adjust. Slight left rudder, steady, steady." Passengers began to notice subtle differences. The violent jolts diminished. Drinks sloshed less, and conversations, quiet whispers, replaced panic. Some prayed silently, others held hands, unsure if relief was premature. For the first time in nearly 10 minutes, there was a flicker of hope. Evan, though terrified, began to sense the rhythm of the aircraft. He felt the subtle push of the wind, the gentle resistance of the yoke, the feedback from the pedals. It was like a dance he had practiced countless times in simulations. But now, the stakes were painfully real. Outside, the runway was still miles away, and the plane was far from stable. But inside the cockpit, a strange sense of calm began to emerge. The passengers' lives rested in the hands of an 11-year-old boy, and he was proving that courage, focus, and knowledge could overcome even the most impossible odds. For a fleeting moment, the impossible felt achievable. Evan's small hands tightened around the yoke, his knuckles whitening. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded in encouragement. "You've got this," she said. And in that moment, amidst alarms, panic, and chaos, a child became the unlikely savior of 222 lives. The cockpit was alive with a tension that made every second feel like a heartbeat stretched into eternity. The alarms were still blaring, though their shrill urgency seemed to fade slightly under Evan's growing focus. Captain Reynolds remained unconscious, slumped in his seat like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Co-pilot Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled less than before, but the fear in her eyes remained. She had handed control over to a child, an 11-year-old who had never flown a real plane. Yet in those trembling hands, she saw an instinctive calm, an eerie precision honed by hours of simulations. Evan's fingers clutched the yoke as he adjusted the plane's angle slightly to counteract a tilt. He remembered every lesson from his uncle and from flight simulators. Tiny movements, small corrections. The plane responds to what you feel, not what you panic about. His young mind calculated angles, altitudes, and speed at lightning pace. Suddenly, the radio crackled back to life. A calm, professional voice came through. "Flight 728, do you read? Please identify yourself." Evan swallowed hard, his throat dry, and answered, "Tower, I'm controlling the plane. I'm 11 years old, we have an emergency and need guidance for landing." A stunned silence followed. Over the tower, controllers exchanged incredulous glances. One muttered under his breath, "Did he just say, a child is flying?" The tower quickly composed itself. "Flight 728, copy that. Stay calm. You are doing the right thing. Listen carefully. We will guide you through every step. You can do this." Evan felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. Every eye on the plane, every passenger, every life depended on his next moves. He nodded, even though the controllers couldn't see him. "Yes, sir, I'm listening." The next minutes were a delicate choreography of voice and movement. Controllers instructed Evan on heading, speed, and altitude. "Adjust the yoke slightly to the left. Now gentle pressure on the right rudder. Maintain 3,000 feet for now." Each instruction was precise, but Evan had to act instantly while monitoring the plane's constant tremors. One small error could send the aircraft into a fatal spin. Inside the cabin, passengers began to sense that control was returning. The violent tilts and dips became less pronounced. A few people dared to whisper words of hope. Some clutched hands, while others stared at the ceiling, silent tears rolling down their faces. Nobody yet knew who was piloting the plane, but an invisible hand seemed to steady Flight 728. Sarah Mitchell watched in awe as Evan responded to each instruction with methodical precision. "Good," she whispered. "Keep it steady. Small movements, Evan. You've got this." She guided him verbally, but she did not touch the controls. He was truly flying now. Minutes stretched like hours. The runway was still miles away, and the plane needed a controlled descent through strong crosswinds. The controllers on the ground continued their steady, calm instructions. "Flaps down to 15 degrees, slight reduction in speed, maintain heading. Watch for gusts from the right." Evan followed each command, his hands moving with surprising confidence. Suddenly, a gust of wind hit the plane, tilting it violently to the side. Passengers screamed, gripping their seats. Evan reacted instantly, adjusting the yoke with a smooth, precise motion. The plane leveled. Murmurs of disbelief and awe spread through the cabin. A child had saved them from certain panic. Evan's small voice broke the tension over the radio. "Tower, we are stable now, ready for final approach." The calm authority in his words startled even the most experienced controllers. From the control tower, one controller whispered, almost to himself, "I've never seen anything like this. A child flying a plane saving everyone." Back in the cockpit, Evan felt a strange mix of fear and determination. He was no longer just a passenger. He was the pilot. Every life on board, the families, the children, the elderly, was resting entirely in his hands. And as the runway came into view in the distance, he knew the most critical moment. The final descent was about to begin. The runway stretched ahead like a fragile lifeline, barely visible through the thin morning haze. Flight 728's passengers felt every subtle dip and tilt, hearts hammering with terror and hope alike. Some prayed, some held hands, and some closed their eyes, clinging to the seat in front of them as if that alone could save their lives. No one knew who was guiding the plane, but a faint sense of steadiness had returned, a fragile thread of hope threading through the cabin. In the cockpit, 11-year-old Evan Carter's small hands tightened around the yoke. His legs barely reached the pedals, and his fingers shook slightly, but his mind was razor-sharp. Every instruction from the tower was a lifeline, every vibration beneath the plane's wings a warning. He could feel the aircraft responding to his tiny adjustments, the delicate push and pull of the yoke translating into the lives of 222 souls on board. "Evan," Sarah Mitchell said softly, almost like a prayer herself, "watch your speed. Slight reduction, flaps down to 20 degrees. Keep it smooth." Evan followed her instructions, holding the plane level, compensating for gusts of wind and gradually descending toward the runway. The engines roared beneath him, almost alive, pushing against the tension in the air. A sudden crosswind threatened to tilt the plane dangerously, and for a moment the world seemed to hang in suspension. He gritted his teeth, nudging the yoke gently to counterbalance the plane. Slowly, carefully, Flight 728 leveled again. In the cabin, the mood was surreal. People whispered, prayed, or clutched each other. Some children had fallen asleep from fear and exhaustion, while others watched the ceiling, eyes wide, sensing something extraordinary unfolding. One man, tears running down his face, murmured, "Someone's saving us." The radio crackled with guidance from the tower. "Flight 728, line up with the runway. Maintain current altitude until final approach. You're doing great. Stay calm." Evan repeated the instructions in his mind, visualizing the descent like a game he had played 1,000 times in simulators, but this time it was terrifyingly real. Minutes passed like hours. Each small adjustment of the yoke felt monumental. A tilt too sharp, a pull too late, a misjudged angle of descent. Any mistake could send the plane into disaster. Sweat ran down Evan's forehead, but he blocked out fear, focusing entirely on the runway that grew ever closer. "Tower, we're aligned," Evan said quietly, his voice steady but barely above a whisper. "Ready for final landing." The plane trembled as the landing gear extended, rattling and shaking under the strain. The runway loomed larger, a strip of hope stretching beneath them. Sarah Mitchell leaned close, her hand brushing Evan's shoulder. "Just like we practiced," she whispered. "Keep it steady, keep it steady." Then the wind gusted again. Flight 728 jolted violently. Screams echoed from the cabin. Evan's small hands reacted instinctively, nudging the yoke with delicate precision. The plane leveled. The landing strip approached faster now, every second a heartbeat, every heartbeat a life hanging in the balance. "Lower slowly. Ease the throttle," the tower instructed. Evan followed perfectly. The wheels kissed the runway in a controlled, terrifyingly precise landing. Sparks flew as the tires met asphalt. The plane screeched, shuddered, and skidded slightly, but it remained upright. Evan kept his focus, guiding Flight 728 along the runway until the aircraft finally rolled to a halt. For a long, frozen moment, silence filled the cabin. Then passengers erupted into screams, sobs, and applause. Families hugged tightly, tears streaming, and some fell to their knees, overcome with relief. Flight attendants ran up and down the aisles, their own faces wet with emotion, helping people to calm down. Sarah Mitchell exhaled deeply, shaking her head in disbelief. You did it, Evan," she said, her voice breaking. "You actually did it." Evan's hands slowly released the yoke, shaking from exhaustion, but his eyes remained bright. He had done what no one thought possible. He had guided a plane carrying 222 people through the most dangerous descent of their lives and delivered them safely to the ground. Outside, the sun continued to rise, unaware of the extraordinary courage that had unfolded in its light. Inside, passengers slowly realized the truth. Their lives had been saved by an 11-year-old boy whose focus, knowledge, and courage had made the impossible possible. And as the applause faded into murmurs of disbelief, one thing was certain. This day, this flight would never be forgotten. The cabin of Flight 728 had finally fallen silent, not with fear this time, but with awe. Passengers slowly emerged from their stunned stupor, gripping each other's hands, patting trembling shoulders, whispering words of disbelief. No one had anticipated what had just occurred. A plane carrying 222 people had survived a catastrophic emergency, guided to safety not by the seasoned pilots alone, but by an 11-year-old boy who had noticed what no adult could. Evan Carter sat quietly in his seat, still pale from the adrenaline coursing through him, legs dangling because they barely reached the floor. His small hands, once gripping the yoke with life-or-death intensity, now rested limply in his lap. Sarah Mitchell placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You saved all of us," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Every single one." Passengers began to gather near the cockpit, craning their necks to see the young boy whose calm hands had held the plane steady. Mothers clutched their children, fathers wiped tears from their eyes, and elderly passengers shook with relief. There were no words adequate enough to describe the magnitude of what had just happened, and yet one phrase seemed to capture the collective sentiment. "He saved us." Outside the plane, emergency crews and fire trucks had lined the tarmac, unaware that the crisis had already passed. Air traffic controllers, still gripping headsets, shared stunned glances. In the control tower, one veteran controller whispered, "I've been in this industry for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like this." News of the event spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within hours, national news outlets were broadcasting the story. Headlines screamed across television screens and websites. 11-year-old saves 222 lives in mid-air crisis. Child pilot prevents catastrophe, the youngest hero in aviation history. Social media erupted, with clips from passengers, cell phones, and interviews flooding timelines, as the public struggled to grasp the impossible truth. Despite the sudden fame, Evan remained quiet, almost invisible in the sea of reporters and cameras. He smiled politely at questions, answering simply, "I just did what I had to do. The pilots helped me and the tower guided me. I couldn't have done it alone." His humility only made the story more extraordinary. Investigators later confirmed what had already become clear to everyone on board. The plane had experienced a near-fatal mechanical failure compounded by pilot incapacitation. Without Evan's intervention, the results would have been catastrophic. Aviation experts called it a miracle, but those who had witnessed it knew it was something more: preparation, instinct, and courage under pressure. For Linda, Evan's mother, the relief was overwhelming. She hugged her son tightly, whispering, "I've never been prouder of you and never more scared." Evan rested against her shoulder, exhausted but calm, aware that life would continue as normal after a day that had been anything but normal. In the days that followed, letters of commendation arrived, invitations to speak and be recognized, but Evan remained grounded, focused on school, friends, and hobbies. He was careful not to let the fame overshadow the fact that the true heroism of that day had been teamwork. The pilots, the controllers, and the passengers who had remained calm in their own way. Yet for those who were on Flight 728, the memory would never fade. Every time the story was recounted, the collective breath of 222 lives held at once would be remembered. Evan's calm hands, his sharp mind, and his courage had turned potential tragedy into a story of hope. A child had reminded the world that courage does not wait for age, and preparation can make the impossible possible. And in quiet moments, long after the cameras and headlines faded, Evan would sometimes replay the day in his mind, not as a hero, but as a boy who simply did what had to be done. But for 222 passengers, the tower staff, the pilots, and the nation watching, he would always be remembered as the child who controlled the yoke when no one else could, and who carried the lives of hundreds in his small, extraordinary hands. The story of Flight 728 became legend, not for the terror, but for the courage and calm that had saved an entire plane. And in the quiet corners of aviation history, one truth remained clear. Heroes come in all sizes, and sometimes the smallest hands can carry the heaviest burdens.